For tonight, we're very lucky to have David Angelis with us. He is a graduate of La Trobe Uni, where he studied biological sciences with an honours in skinks. But he still likes frogs, so we like him. And tonight he's going to be talking about NEROC to now, historic and current distribution of frogs in the Yarra, Middle Yarra catchment. So welcome, David.
Well, thanks very much, Lynette. And thanks for inviting me in to speak tonight. Acknowledgements and apologies first. So, they talk about imposter syndrome. It's often flung around when self-deprecating, but I reckon it's probably legitimate tonight. Having said that, there are a few people that I do need to thank for being mentors and providing guidance. One of them being Craig Tweeland, who's at the back and here with us tonight. Brian Malone, Jeff Hurd, and maybe a suspicious looking character who you'll see in a few slides' time. But I've also, for probably the first time, giving a presentation where I've got photo permissions for the majority of the photos that I'm using. And I probably have to at least acknowledge Matt Clancy and Marion Anstis for providing most of the photos that you'll be seeing in tonight's presentation. And of course, acknowledgement for Murray and Angus Martin, who's hiding somewhere. Oh, right there. In plain sight. And Nick and anybody else who might be here that has information that I've stolen for tonight's presentation, but who I'm not necessarily familiar with. At least you'll be cited. So, one more apology for anyone who might be blue colourblind. This is, at least according to the department in 2006, well, it's a Yarra catchment, divided into lower, middle and upper. So roughly, middle Yarra catchment, this mid-blue, starting at about Dights Falls, Abbotsford, give or take, and then up towards the foothill country, Yarra Gwen, and not quite, by the time you get to Hillsville, I think most people would argue that you're getting to the upper Yarra by that stage. I will digress a little bit in terms of speaking about the distribution of the different species found in Yarra catchment, outside of the Yarra catchment, but not too often. For the most part, that mid-blue sort of area is what I'd be focusing on. So, mystery's over. For those of you who are wondering what NEROC refers to. So, this report, which is very well known, by a very well known parks ranger, some people might call him infamous, Cam Beardsall, but a brilliant naturalist, and for want of a better word, institution. But NEROC being the North East Regional Association of Councils, and in terms of the area that we're interested in tonight, including Nillumbik, Manningham, Banyule, and some of the other municipalities on either side. But the main focus of Cam's report on sites of faunal and habitat significance in North East Melbourne was focused on the major river catchments, or two of them, the Yarra and the Plenty river gorge and valley. And as part of Murray's NEROC report, among all the other faunal groups that he looked at, frogs were a main feature. And many of the records that are talked about in that report, at least until that stage, hadn't been published elsewhere, although many of them are in the Atlas of, well, what used to be the Atlas of Victorian Wildlife, now the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas. So in terms of data on frog distribution within the Yarra catchment. Most of it tends to be incidental and opportunistic, and it's found in databases like the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas, although there was an honours student, Ewan McGlip, who Murray supervised in wrote his thesis in 1994, and I think Angelis co-supervised at Ewan, who looked at the distribution of frogs in the lower Yarra catchment. But apart from that and these database records, and a little bit of work that Melbourne Water's done since through some of its programs, there hasn't been a lot of focus on the Yarra catchment, particularly the lower and the middle Yarra catchment in terms of frogs, maybe surprisingly. And of course, the Atlas of Australian Wildlife, which should incorporate all the records in the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas, as well as the numerous other atlases and wildlife databases, not only in Victoria but throughout Australia. And it can be possible to use those incidental and opportunistic records, if they're used carefully, to infer patterns of persistence and occupation for a particular species, as Andrew Harmer did for reptiles and frogs throughout Greater Melbourne. However, so I talked about somebody suspicious. We actually submitted a photo of Graham Gillespie at this spot to the Australian Society of Herpetologists photo competition a few years ago. Very appropriately in a category called Herpetological Heroes. Graham's been called many things over the years, but perhaps legitimately, or most legitimately, he can be accused of being extremely thorough and extremely efficient, and having a brilliant knowledge of Victoria's frogs. But something that Graham tends to emphasise is this issue of gaps or voids in data and information in terms of species distribution. So even for more formal studies, in many cases, let alone incidental observations, there tends to be a bias towards spots that are easy to access, along tracks and roads. And there are many fewer records, or much less effort spent on going off track, off road, deep into the bush, and filling some of these information gaps in terms of what you might find in these sort of places. Okay, so not coming over the speed list, maybe we can turn that up a bit. So I'm one of these people who can't help playing frog calls when the opportunity presents itself. But maybe that's at 100.
Sorry.
We'll have to cope with that. So it'll be the chorus will be a little quieter tonight. So we'll run through the suspects, starting with common frog, one that most of you will be familiar with, and as this name suggests, still, thankfully for it, one of the more common species around Melbourne. Although even for species like the common froglet, there's been, at least anecdotally, a decline from its likely historical abundance. So people twice my age, give or take, often tell the story of finding tadpoles literally in puddles on the side of the road, and rarely do you get that anymore, at least in suburban Melbourne. But this is probably one of the species that would have been doing that sort of thing once upon a time. Nevertheless, still very common, and a species that's now known to be resistant to chytrid infection, and thanks to the work of Nick and Dave Hunter and some others, now noted as being responsible for potentially being a vector for chytrid to other frogs, including critically endangered species like the southern crawlerry frog. Next. One of Murray's favourites. With an awesome call, even for a frog as small as this one is. So maybe a fraction larger than the common froglet. Again, another one that many of you will be familiar with, but a bit less common, and a bit less common than it historically used to be. Perhaps not having declined, at least in suburban Melbourne, to the same extent as, say, the southern tidelet, but nevertheless declined to an extent. So, for example, Craig knows Belvedere very well, which I think is one spot where this species is no longer found now. It's disappeared from much of the Mullen Valley, still found in pockets, like 100 acres reserve in park orchards, still relatively common in some of the seasonally wet gullies in Warrandyte, and then north of the river. But other than that, perhaps not done so well in the inner suburbs or further into the developed areas. So the species with which it's often sympatric, so you often find them in the same sort of habitat, although not always, but hasn't done as well, again, as the Victorian smooth froglet, to the extent that it's considered vulnerable in Victoria, at least on the advisory list, which the department maintains. And this is Craig's main study species, having spent 20 plus years looking at these very cryptic frogs that largely spend most of their lives concealed under leaf litter. But you can see there aren't as many points on the map as there were for Victorian smooth froglet, and maybe a suggestion that Victorian smooth froglet ever so slightly isn't fussy about occupying slightly wetter or damper sites than what the southern toadlet is, which can result in issues for it, because both of those species are terrestrial egg layers in damp depressions or seasonal gullies that flood with autumn and or mainly winter rains. This data comes from an honours project through La Trobe, Yoni Kiljack, a few years ago, for the southwest of Victoria, Warrnambool sort of area, showing rainfall over several decades throughout the year. And what's interesting is, although, for example, during the Millennium Drought, there may have been, in those years, enough rainfall to stimulate the eggs to hatch. If the rainfall didn't last through spring up until the time of metamorphosis, there's potential for the tadpoles to perish before they had a chance to finish their development and emerge, which Yoni's data kind of suggested. Mind you, this is circumstantial, so especially when presented like this. But to give you an idea, eggs are being laid in about April, middle of autumn, give or take. Hatching after, but not completing their metamorphosis until about November, so they take at least 6 months to, before they can emerge and escape the perils of breeding in a seasonal environment. And this is a much reduced snapshot at a particular site, an isolated population of, or now isolated population of southern toadlets in the Mullen Valley, and it's showing exactly that for the two particular seasons that it was monitored there. So in 2009, the tadpoles desiccating, there was enough rainfall earlier on in the season for the eggs to hatch and for the tadpoles to start their development, but at this particular site in 2009 there wasn't enough rainfall in October to sustain them through to end of development. But in the following year, 2010, there was. So they recruited successfully that particular year. As well, there's potential for this sort of thing to be influenced by groundwater, water table, and changes in hydrology can also interfere, which may be the case, for example, in the Coronado bushland, where Craig's spent a lot of his time. So some sites are hydrated, perhaps equally or if not more from the groundwater than rainfall. But at this particular site, it's Silurian, it's on clay, but it's also raised, it's a perched artificial depression. So it's reliant pretty much entirely on rainfall to sustain it. Okay, now, this is Craig's map. So, taking a fairly conservative, albeit qualitative approach to deciding extant versus possibly extinct. So we've got a large chunk of the Yarra catchment there, mullums, this area in here, red flags indicating sites where the species may still be present, but being conservative, we mentioned an isolated population in the mullum. It's possible that there could be some others around, but none have been detected for a while. The only reason that those red flags are still there is because they're not perhaps being written off just yet, but it's likely that the situation is worse than what's showing up here, and it already looks pretty bad. So the next step for this data will be eventually to analyse it quantitatively and do some modelling, some occupancy modelling across most of the species distribution in Victoria. Craig has done a lot of work in Gippsland as well. And it's a similar picture, perhaps with the exception of a couple of spots in Gippsland where they still seem to be doing quite well. But apart from that, it's looking perhaps bleaker than what was initially thought. Now, why does poor Bibberns or Brown's toadlet get a dirty, great big X? So this has been an interesting question, one very much of interest, because this masterpiece of Murray's, which when I sent it to Craig, he actually seriously said that he was going to frame it and hang it up on his wall. And I think it's deserving of that. It's heritage now. Shows, lucky Murray used colour to show this. Hopefully nobody's read blue colour line. The delineation with a very narrow hybrid overlap between Bibberns toadlet in the blue and southern toadlet in the red. And the line falls, at least when Murray did his work in the 60s, to the west of Donnybrook, Craigieburn sort of area. And according to Murray's map, Bibberns don't really come in, well, there's, as he crossed out there, that's largely forested country, but north of perhaps the Whittlesea area. Interestingly, Peter Robertson has got toadlets in Whittlesea, which at least morphologically look like Bibberns. So there could be something going on around the edges. Even so, it's unlikely that Bibberns are penetrating down anywhere near the Yarra catchment. And this corroborates Craig's findings as well. having found only frogs morphologically like Schistophanes, semi-marmorata, the southern toadlet, in places like Ganyang, Pennington Hill, etc. And in fact, the person responsible for several of these records, being Cam Beardsell, now acknowledges, so Cam in fact went back to many of these sites in the late 90s and agrees that yes, in fact, many of these records that were lodged in the atlas as Schistophanes hibridi are in fact Schistophanes semi-marmorata, and need to be changed, which he's amenable to doing, so that might be on the books. So, begs the question, and Nick and Craig and Murray and Angus aren't allowed to answer.
Thank God.
So, what toadlet is that?
Turn it over.
Turn it over. Cheating. So,
Where was it seen?
where was it seen? Good, another good question. So, a little bit confusing perhaps, it's got yellow suffusion on its upper arms and the rear of the thighs, and even a little bit on its backside there. But this is a southern toadlet from Donvale. So, possibly one of the reasons as to why toadlets have been misidentified in the Melbourne area, including at this particular site. There's a historic department record of Vibrance toadlet being there, and it's not. They're all Schistophanes semi-marmorata, identifiable by some of Murray's transparencies from the 60s from Wallen East, which shows the difference morphologically, which should generally be right. So the two parent species, Vibrony-like, ventral pattern, semi-marmorata-like, with more of the orange or pink area showing at either end, and a motley hybrid in between, the mongrel. We'll run through these ones reasonably quickly, so more of the usual suspects. Like the common froglet, spotted marsh frog, still reasonably abundant through the Melbourne area. Not generally being so fussy as to whether it breeds in permanent situations or occasionally temporary situations, but perhaps taking a little bit longer to develop than the common froglet. I should have mentioned, how long does a common froglet take to develop? If a southern toadlet's taking 6 months at least to complete its metamorphosis, common froglet, minimum of 6 weeks, usually longer than that, up to 3 months. So still nowhere near as long, which possibly goes some way to explaining why they are still able to persist in all the areas that they are, particularly in times of drought. And that's our spotted marsh frog, which is currently the subject of a master's project, and Murray's seen this map. So Cathy Potter, who's currently working at the Australian Museum, but very well known within the New South Wales frog group, FATS, is doing her research at the moment, revisiting the southern and northern call races of spotted marsh frog in Victoria, but remotely using the Australian Museum's relatively new frog ID mobile phone app. But they've already got enough records that she's picking up some interesting things. So these are largely based, I think, on the hatching, some of Murray's work, but also Dale Roberts, when he did his PhD in the 70s, and also collaborated a little bit with Murray in Victoria, looked at the distribution of northern and southern call races of spotted marsh frog in Victoria, with a bit of an overlap to the north of Melbourne, north of the Divide. But what Sally's already noticing is that there's a little bit of encroachment of frogs toward the northern core race end of the scale, south of that line, approaching the north of Melbourne, but also interestingly, getting a few very confused accents of northern core race down in Gippsland. And why that is a good question. There is a possibility, some of the folk at Museum Victoria found out when they were looking at brown tree frog and Latoria parryewingi, which is a common name escapes me, Victorian, some people call it. In the King Lake area, they found parryewingi individuals well within the southern Ewingi territory, and wondered why that might be until they asked the landowner, who confessed that some frogs had been transported from further north and released in the dam. Hence the confusion there. Could it be possible that something similar has happened here? It's certainly not out of the question. So relatively spotted nostril, but with stripes, and confusing for some people at least getting their eye in to them at the beginning, because they both can or may not have pale vertical stripe down the middle of the back, but it's the stripes to either side that we're wanting to see. And perhaps breeding or leaning towards slightly more permanent or deeper sites than the spotted marshal.
And there are 2 egg races.
Yeah, and 2 egg races, yes. And where's the division between those?
Somewhere in the middle there.
Somewhere.
That's a map around somewhere.
We'll have to send that one around next. So one that very many people are familiar with, the good old pobblebuck or southern or eastern banjo frog, which again is still relatively abundant or common in most places, but slightly more cryptic in that when it's not breeding, they're a burrowing frog, not as elaborate as say the spadefoot toads, but they get under rocks and logs and in loose soil and leaf litter. People often dig them up in their compost or in the veggie garden. So it can remain a little bit more cryptic, but one of the largest frogs that we've now got remaining in this particular part of the world, the growling grass frog, having disappeared, unfortunately. But female banjos may be pushing a little bit more than 7 centimetres from the snout with that side. And found in the Melbourne area alongside with a different subspecies, or what's currently at least still considered to be a subspecies of eastern banjo frog. The difference between them, subspecies insularis, not so much orange or yellow patterning on the lower flank, and with generally a pale, narrow stripe down the middle of the back. And if you've got really good eyes, not so much webbing in between its toes compared to subspecies Dumerili. So you have to ask them nicely to spread their toes if you're having trouble pulling them apart. Otherwise, a difficult one sometimes to tell. But this subspecies occurring from the Angelis area to the southwest of the city, or southwest of Geelong, through Gippsland, pretty much. Dumerili extends much further west, and both subspecies extend a little way north. Eastern banjo frog subspecies Dumerili all along the Murray system, pretty much. A very interesting one that's more well known from perhaps arid and semi-arid regions, but at least historically came well down into Greater Melbourne. These are two of the southernmost records, although interestingly, this species is also known to occur on the sands around Cranbourne, and much further to the southwest. But those are a couple of Cam Beardsell's records from 1990, thereabouts. One being just opposite Westerfolds Park, and the other one at Finn's Reserve, not far away, on the Yarra floodplain. So very likely that this species once, at least, used to occur on the Yarra floodplain. One of the difficulties with detecting this species is, of course, being largely fossorial frog, spending a significant part of the year underground, not uncommonly. They can go for a long time without being detected until there are rains sufficient enough to draw them out. So I think Don Bradshaw, University of Western Australia, did some work on two closely related species, but over there, now Batrachus sutor and Aquilonius, and found that both of them can probably spend at least a year and a half, if not 2 years, excavating underground, inactive, before there are sufficient rains to bring them out. Whether our Neobatrachus pseudolate can do the same thing is a good question, but it's quite possible because it extends all the way up into the Mallee and beyond, where rainfall is a lot less reliable than it is in this part of the world. Another one that most people will be familiar with, common garden frog in Melbourne, having the advantage, unlike a common froglet, of sticky pads on its digits, fingers and toes, which obviously allows it to climb, although not usually so high as, say, Perrin's tree frog, which does what its name suggests it should do and often gets right up into the tree, although you often find them lower down, and obviously they all have to come back to water to breed. But overlapping, at least in this part of the world, and in fact over much of both species distributions, with the very closely related whistling tree frog. So closely related that Murray, in collaboration with Katie Date, Minnie Smith and Paul Oliver, published a paper a few years ago identifying likely hybrids based on morphology, but also calls. So morphology, yes, one of the ways that's often said is semi-reliably in distinguishing between whistling and southern brown tree frog, black blotching or marbling in the groin, whereas Latoria ewingi, more often than not, maybe a little bit of speckling, but nothing much more than that. But more reliably perhaps, but harder to figure out, the digits on Latoria ewingi are slightly larger than the digits on Latoria veroli, and is one of the characters that Murray and Paul and Katie looked at, along with the width of the snout. So width of the snout being slightly broader on Latoria veroli. Good luck if you can pick that one in the field. And height of the metatarsal tubercle, I think, was another characteristic. So again, ask nicely and then let you measure them. But as interestingly, or some might say more interesting, there's a distinct difference in the calls, obviously between Latoria ewingi and Latoria veroli, which you can see from the waveforms here, and the hybrid or putative hybrid, obviously being somewhere intermediate. So in the length or duration of the call, which is much shorter in the Latoria uni, the pulse rate is lower. Murray can explain this one much better than I can. And the dominant frequency is greater in the Latoria uni than Latoria virili. And as you would expect, putative hybrid is somewhere in between, which makes identifying them even more enjoyable. So another one, perhaps with a couple of questionable records. This one near Lilydale was one that was entered into the Atlas of Living Australia without any sort of verification, apart from a quick computerised version. Yeah.
I was surprised as well, yeah.
Latoria uni, most probably. That record there is one of Glenn Jamison's, who's also a fairly well-known, well, he was a fairly well-known staff at Parks Victoria for a long time. That was actually recorded during one of the very early frog censuses at Glenn's wetland. And Glenn was fairly sure that that's what was recorded there. I don't know if that recording still exists. While Latoria leisuri can be a facultative pond breeder, it's often in close proximity to streams and creeks that you'd usually expect to find it in. So possible, still perhaps a question mark over that one. These ones are cans, and they are in the Yarra River at Monique's Island, Bend of Isles, which is very rocky. He made these records in the late 90s. Another one at Yarra Gorge, which again, fairly rocky, the sort of habitat that Latoria leisuri tend to like. Good question as to whether they're still in this part of the world. Cam suspects probably not. But interestingly, it was Cam who found this species relatively recently, again, in the Upper Yarra. So, where? Ethan Creek. So, golf course in Warburton. 2012, Cam found it there. And also on the Watts River behind Mount Juliet. So it's possible, if not likely, that this species is still present in the Upper Yarra, if not the Middle Yarra catchment. But a question that we may look at, hopefully next season, in collaboration with James Fraser at Melbourne Water, there might be some potential to do some remote acoustic recording as well as visual searches for them. Now we have Nick's favourite. All right, well, several of mine as well. I think this one's a lot of people's favourite. The well-known growling grass frog, which unfortunately, as far as is known, no longer occurs in this part of the world. Records as recent as, going back now, more than a decade, a little bit further up in the Yarra catchment. They persisted at Yellingbo for a little while. Craig remembers very well finding them there, but probably no longer, unfortunately.
They turn up again, we'll build their house, you say.
Yeah. So, to give some idea of the species contraction over time, records up until 2004. And then afterwards. So maybe a similar number of dots, because over time there's been an increase in reporting as well. So there is some bias or influence there, but you can still clearly see the range contraction just based on the atmosphere. So now having been lost from this area. That's of most interest to us tonight. But still holding on to the north and west of Melbourne as far east as the Darabin Creek catchment, and still down in the Pakenham Yarra area. Now, these will be ones that Nick's very familiar with. So Jeff and Nick's Roddy, this largely came out of Jeff's work from his PhD when he was swabbing growlers in the Merry Creek catchment and found, as the graphs kind of explain, that probability of Q-tooth infection goes down with increasing salinity using electrical conductivity as a proxy. And the same with temperature. Probability of infection decreases, that nice model line, with increasing water temperature. So salinity and temperature have an effect on the virulence of Q-tooth infection, at least in this species. Which may be a reason why it's still holding on where it is. So in fact, those catchments to the north and west of Melbourne, being largely basaltic, are naturally more saline than the catchments further east. But also with bluestone quarrying or quarrying for basalt, there's an artificial increase in salinity in many of those wetlands that are being created as a result. And at least for the growling grass frog, able to tolerate high salinity to an extent. So maybe more water. An interesting one in the Melbourne area, because the first time that it really turned up was when Murray and who was with you, Murray, at the time? Peter Harrison, yeah, turned it up at just the west side of Yan Yan Reservoir in 1985 in off Dunnart's Road, or what it's now probably known as Dunnart's Swamp sort of area. And since then it's gone gangbusters, probably not unfair to say. But not a species that's indigenous to the Melbourne area, that being the first time that it turned up. And now it's pretty well widespread and still taking the opportunity to spread to new water bodies, new opportunities. But as I mentioned, very large discs on its fingers and toes, and although they have to come back to water to breed, deposit their eggs, they'll get right up into trees and occasionally right up into hollows and almost into the canopy sometimes. They'll also be on logs and rocks and under the house. How did they get to Melbourne is a good question. It's possible that this species, well, may be a reasonable hypothesis, but because of this species' tree-loving habits, it often gets under the bark and into nooks and crevices of, say, red gums. North of the divide, people bringing firewood back, potentially there could be several avenues for this species having been introduced to the Melbourne area. And to give you some idea of its expansion rather than contraction in the Melbourne area, so we're almost getting towards where Murray and Peter found it back in 1985. That's an interesting record in the Australian Museum. The location's given as Yarra Creek. There's Yarra Creek in Tasmania, where this species doesn't occur. But there's also Scotsman's Creek in Oakley sort of area. It was once known as Yarra Creek. It's a bit of a mystery as to where that record belongs. But other than that, mainly north of the divide, following the Murray, penetrating through the Mallee into South Australia and through Gippsland, historically. And that's what it looks like now. So pretty much infiltrated the majority of the Greater Melbourne area, albeit at the moment, at least, maybe a bit more frequently to the east. And interestingly, only this summer, Peter Hogan recorded one in the Otways. So it's they never used to. So that's pretty much following the Wimmera River into Western Victoria. They never used to make it down into this area. If they're in the Otways now, interesting to know how many there might be. But before too long, they might have bridged the entire southwest of Victoria. As to what issue that might create is a good question. We don't even know that for the Melbourne area. But another one that may be of concern, but again it's a good question, is the eastern dwarf trefoil Victoria fox, which never used to occur in Victoria, but natural distribution a little bit further south of Wollongong, and comfortably managed to establish feral populations, particularly in the Yarra catchment. And in fact it was Nick and Graham Gillespie who turned this species up for the first time in Melbourne in 1999 at a sand quarry in Moorabbin. Yeah. And it's spread itself around a little bit more since then. But to give you some idea, looking at records for 10 years, 2004 to 2014, a few of us have been out into this part of the world looking, in my case, particularly for a PhD student at La Trobe who's working on this species, doing a behavioural project, but doing a little bit of ground truthing in the South Warrandyte Wonga Park area. Out of 12 wetlands inspected, every one of them had a Latoria thalax in it. Not to suggest that they found in every wetland within Warrandyte Wonga Park, but it wouldn't be surprising if they are now occupying the majority of them. I say wetland, most of them are dams. And that's what it looks like, including records from the past 5 years. So a combination, probably, of an increase in recording. This includes some recent Melbourne water frog census records that don't yet appear in the Atlas of Victorian wildlife. The only record, at least that I'm aware of, on this map where the species most likely no longer occurs is that one there. That's at La Trobe Union's Wildlife Reserve. Wildlife Sanctuary 1 turned up, and she's not there anymore. But apart from that, it's a good question as to whether they still occur in some of these sort of outlying spots. It wouldn't be surprising if they still do. There are some other examples of this species having developed locally since its reintroduction, probably the most notable being Plenty Gorge, moraine wetlands. So it was reported there regularly up till the mid-late 2000s, where the fellow there who was reporting them every season suddenly wasn't reporting them anymore, and they don't appear to have sustained themselves there for whatever reason. Right, and that just about brings us to the end. So, they're my qualifications. Thank you very much.